My girlfriend and her friends were bullying a waiter at a restaurant on her birthday dinner, mocking his accent and making him clean up messes they deliberately made. When I told her to stop, she laughed. "Chill out, it's just a harmless joke. If you don't like it, then leave, you're being way too sensitive." I nodded and said, "Actually, that's not a bad idea at all." Then I stood up, took my keys, picked up her expensive present, and calmly walked out. Their laughter died suddenly when the waiter returned with the bill and they realized I had only paid for my single meal, leaving them with a $20,000 tab. You know those moments when you realize you've been living with a complete stranger? Yeah, well, I had one of those tonight. And let me tell you, it was a real eye-opener. My name's Mia, and up until about 3 hours ago, I thought I knew everything about my girlfriend Zoe. We'd been together for 2 years, and I genuinely believed she was the love of my life. Boy, was I wrong about that one. So picture this, it's Zoe's 25th birthday, and she's been planning this massive celebration dinner for weeks. She picked this ridiculously upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where they charge $50 for a piece of fish the size of your thumb. But hey, it was her special day, right? I wanted to make it perfect for her. I've been saving up for months to buy her this gorgeous diamond bracelet. We're talking serious money here, the kind that makes your credit card weep. But seeing her face light up was going to be worth every penny. Or so I thought. The evening started off normal enough. Zoe had invited her usual crew, Chloe, Nora, and Ruby. These three had been her best friends since college, and honestly, I'd never been their biggest fan. There was always something about the way they treated people that rubbed me the wrong way. But tonight, I was about to see just how deep that nastiness really went. We got seated at this beautiful corner table with a view of the city skyline. The restaurant was buzzing with that sophisticated energy you only find in places where the appetizers cost more than most people's grocery budget. Everything seemed perfect. That's when our waiter approached. His name was Liam, and you could tell immediately that English wasn't his first language. He had this gentle way about him, really trying his best to make sure we had everything we needed. His accent was thick, Eastern European, I think, but his English was perfectly understandable. At first, everything was fine. He took our drink orders, brought out the bread, standard stuff. But then I started noticing the way Zoe and her friends were looking at each other. These little smirks, these knowing glances. I should have paid more attention to those warning signs. It started small. When Liam came back to take our food orders, Zoe began speaking really slowly and loudly, like he was deaf or something. "We would like the lobster," she said, enunciating each word like she was talking to a toddler. Chloe jumped right in. "Yeah, and make sure it's cooked properly. You do know what properly cooked means, right?" She was grinning like this was the funniest thing in the world. I felt my stomach twist a little, but I figured maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were just being, I don't know, overly helpful? But deep down, I knew better. When Liam brought our appetizers, that's when things really started going south. Nora accidentally knocked over her water glass, sending water cascading across the table and onto the floor. "Oops," she said with this fake innocent voice. "So sorry about that. Could you clean this up for us?" Liam immediately grabbed some towels and started mopping up the mess, apologizing profusely even though it wasn't his fault. While he was bent over cleaning, Ruby started mimicking his accent under her breath. So sorry," she whispered in this exaggerated impression that made the other girls giggle. Have you ever felt your heart sink and your blood boil at the exact same time? Because that's exactly what was happening to me right then. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, this was just the beginning. When Liam brought out our main courses, Zoe claimed her steak was overcooked. Now, I could see that steak from where I was sitting, and it looked absolutely perfect. But she made this huge production out of it, waving him over and speaking in that same condescending tone. "This is completely ruined," she announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. I specifically asked for medium rare. "Do you understand what medium rare means?" She was practically shouting at this point. Liam's face went red, and he started apologizing again, offering to have the kitchen prepare a new one. But Zoe wasn't done. "Maybe if you listen better, we wouldn't have this problem. It's really not that complicated." Chloe chimed in with, "Maybe they don't have steak where he's from." The whole table erupted in laughter except for me. I felt sick. Absolutely sick. This man was just trying to do his job, and they were treating him like garbage for their own entertainment. But the worst part? I could see how much it was hurting him. He kept his professional smile, but I could see the pain in his eyes. Throughout the next hour, they found every possible excuse to mess with this poor guy. Ruby accidentally dropped her fork 3 separate times, making him crawl under the table to retrieve it. Nora kept changing her order, claiming she'd said something completely different than what she'd actually ordered. And Zoe? She was orchestrating the whole thing like some twisted conductor. Every time Liam walked away, they'd burst into laughter and start imitating his accent again. "Thank you so much," Chloe would say, and they'd all lose it. It was like watching a pack of hyenas circling their prey. But here's the thing that really got to me: other people in the restaurant were starting to notice. I could see the looks of disgust on nearby diners' faces. I could see the other waitstaff exchanging worried glances. And I could see Liam's shoulders getting more and more hunched with each interaction. This wasn't just casual rudeness. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty. And I was sitting there, complicit in it all, just because I didn't want to cause a scene on Zoe's birthday. The final straw came when they ordered dessert. Zoe deliberately knocked over the salt shaker, sending salt cascading across the pristine white tablecloth and onto the floor. Then she looked right at Liam and said, "Oopsie. Looks like you've got another mess to clean up." As he bent down to sweep up the salt, all 4 of them started laughing and making comments about how clumsy he was. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. "Zoe," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to stop this right now." The laughter at the table died instantly. All eyes turned to me, and I could feel the shift in energy immediately. Zoe's expression went from amused to annoyed in about half a second. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharp. "This is cruel," I continued, my heart pounding but my resolve strengthening. "He's just trying to do his job, and you're all treating him terribly. This needs to stop." You know what she did? She laughed. Not just a little chuckle, but a full-blown, head-thrown-back laugh like I just told the funniest joke in the world. "Chill out, it's just a harmless joke," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "If you don't like it, then leave, you're being way too sensitive." The other girls were nodding in agreement, like I was the crazy one for having basic human decency. Ruby actually rolled her eyes at me. "It's not that serious, Mia. We're just having fun." "Fun?" I repeated, my voice getting stronger. "You think humiliating someone is fun?" Zoe's expression hardened. "Look, if you can't handle a little teasing, maybe you should just go. Don't ruin my birthday because you can't take a joke." That's when something clicked inside me. Something final and irreversible. I looked around the table at these 4 people I thought I knew, and I realized I was staring at strangers. Cruel, heartless strangers. I nodded slowly and said, "Actually, that's not a bad idea at all." The confusion on their faces was almost comical. They clearly weren't expecting me to agree with them. But I was just getting started. I stood up calmly, reached into my jacket pocket, and pulled out the small velvet box containing Zoe's birthday present, that diamond bracelet I'd worked overtime for months to afford. I placed it gently on the table in front of her. "Happy birthday, Zoe," I said quietly. Then I picked the box right back up and slipped it into my pocket. Her mouth fell open. "What are you doing?" "Exactly what you suggested," I replied, grabbing my keys from the table. "I'm leaving." Now here's where things get really interesting. See, when we'd arrived at the restaurant, I'd given them my credit card to keep the tab open. Standard procedure for a big group dinner, right? What the girls didn't know was that earlier today, I'd called the restaurant to discuss the evening's arrangements. I'd wanted tonight to be special, so I'd pre-authorized a specific amount on my card, enough to cover my own meal and drinks, nothing more. I'd planned to pay for Zoe's dinner separately as part of her gift, but that was before I discovered what kind of person she really was. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear confused murmuring behind me. They thought I was just being dramatic, that I'd cool off and come back. They had no idea what was coming. I found Liam near the kitchen, and my heart broke a little more seeing how defeated he looked. I walked up to him and said quietly, "I am so sorry about how they treated you tonight. That was completely unacceptable." His eyes filled with gratitude, and he shook his head. "Thank you, miss. But please, don't worry about me." "What's your name?" I asked. "Liam," he replied. "Well, Liam, I want you to know that not everyone is like them. You seem like a kind person, and you deserve to be treated with respect." I pulled out a $100 bill, money I'd planned to add to Zoe's gift, and pressed it into his hand. "Thank you for your patience tonight." He tried to refuse, but I insisted. Then I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, leaving behind not just a relationship, but an entire version of myself that I wasn't proud of. I sat in my car for a few minutes, hands shaking as the reality of what I'd just done hit me. 2 years of my life, gone. But you know what? I felt lighter than I had in months. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Text after text from Zoe, then Chloe, then all of them. At first, the messages were angry. How could you just leave like that? You're being ridiculous. Come back right now. But then, about 30 minutes later, the tone changed dramatically. Mia, we need to talk. Call me now. This isn't funny anymore. Come back. Answer your phone. I ignored them all. Instead, I drove to my favorite late-night diner, ordered a piece of pie, and tried to process everything that had happened. I was halfway through my apple pie when my phone rang. It was Zoe, and against my better judgment, I answered. MIA. She screamed before I could even say hello. What did you do? I left, I said calmly. Just like you told me to. The bill, Mia. They're saying your card was only authorized for your meal. They want $20,000. $20,000. Let me tell you how we got to that number, because it's actually pretty funny in a twisted way. See, these girls had gone absolutely crazy with their orders. We're talking multiple bottles of the most expensive wine on the menu, the kind that costs more per bottle than most people make in a week. They'd ordered practically every appetizer, the most expensive entrees, and desserts for days. They'd treated the evening like their own personal feast, assuming I'd be footing the bill for their princess party. But here's the beautiful part. When I called the restaurant earlier to set up the evening, I'd specifically told them I wanted to cover only my own expenses. I was planning to handle Zoe's meal separately, and I figured her friends could pay for themselves like normal adults. The restaurant had set up the authorization accordingly. So when I left, my card covered exactly what I'd consumed: 1 Caesar salad, 1 grilled salmon, and 2 glasses of wine. Total, about $85. Everything else, all that expensive wine, all those premium dishes, all those extra desserts they'd ordered while tormenting poor Liam, that was all on them. You need to come back right now and fix this. Zoe was still screaming into the phone. Actually, I don't, I replied. You're all adults. I'm sure you can figure out how to pay for the food you ordered. We don't have that kind of money. Then maybe you shouldn't have ordered that kind of food, I said simply. The line went quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head. Mia, please. I'm sorry about what happened with the waiter. We were just joking around. You know we didn't mean anything by it. There it was, the manipulation I'd somehow missed for 2 whole years. The way she could flip from cruel to sweet the moment she needed something from me. No, Zoe, I said firmly. You weren't joking around. You were being deliberately cruel to someone who couldn't fight back. That's not humor, that's bullying. But it's my birthday, she whined, like that somehow made everything okay. And you've certainly made it memorable, I replied. Then I hung up. Over the next hour, I got calls from all of them. Chloe tried the guilt trip approach. How could you do this to us? We're supposed to be friends. Nora went with anger. This is completely unfair. You can't just abandon us like this. And Ruby attempted bargaining. Look, we'll apologize to the waiter. We'll make it right. Just come back and help us with the bill. But you know what none of them said? Not a single genuine apology for their behavior. Not one acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong. Just anger that their actions had finally had consequences. I turned off my phone and drove home to my apartment, the apartment I'd been planning to give up so Zoe and I could move in together next month. Funny how quickly priorities can shift. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages and missed calls. Most were from Zoe and her friends, but there were a few from numbers I didn't recognize. Curious, I listened to one of the voicemails. Hi, this is manager speaking from the restaurant. I wanted to personally thank you for your kindness toward our staff member last night. Liam told me what happened, and I wanted you to know that your tip meant a great deal to him. We also wanted to inform you that the situation with the remaining bill has been resolved, though I thought you might like to know that the police were called when the other party initially refused to pay. The police. They'd actually tried to skip out on the bill and had to be threatened with arrest before they'd pay up. I shouldn't have been surprised, but somehow I was. I called the restaurant back and spoke with the manager directly. Apparently, after I'd left, the girls had spent another hour trying to figure out how to get out of paying. They'd claimed there had been some mistake, that I was supposed to cover everything, that they were victims of some elaborate scam. But here's the thing about expensive restaurants, they don't mess around when it comes to payment. The manager had calmly explained that each person was responsible for what they'd ordered, and if they couldn't pay, they'd need to call the police to sort it out. In the end, they'd had to call parents, borrow money, and max out credit cards to cover the bill. Chloe's dad had to drive down with his credit card to help. Nora had to call her ex-boyfriend to borrow money. Ruby had to ask her sister for an emergency loan. And Zoe? Well, Zoe had to sell some jewelry and borrow money from her parents to cover her portion. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no, it gets so much better. About a week later, I ran into a mutual acquaintance at the grocery store. Apparently, word had gotten around about what happened that night. And you know what? People weren't exactly sympathetic to Zoe and her crew. It turns out that their treatment of service workers wasn't a new thing. Multiple people came forward with stories about similar incidents: servers at other restaurants, retail workers, delivery drivers. There was a whole pattern of behavior that I'd somehow missed or ignored. But here's where the real revenge comes in, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. Remember Liam, the waiter they'd tormented? Well, he'd been working at that restaurant to put himself through college. He was studying business management and was actually incredibly smart, spoke 4 languages fluently and had a degree from his home country that he was working to get recognized here. The manager I'd spoken with was so impressed by how professionally Liam had handled the situation that he offered him a promotion to assistant manager. Liam's story, about working hard despite facing discrimination and harassment, ended up inspiring the restaurant owner to create a new program supporting immigrant workers in the hospitality industry. Meanwhile, word spread through social media about what had happened. Someone had recorded part of the incident on their phone, and while they didn't post the video out of respect for Liam's privacy, they did share the general story. It went viral in our local community. The restaurant, which had been struggling slightly due to the economic climate, saw a huge surge in business from people who wanted to support them after hearing about their commitment to treating all workers with dignity. They had to hire additional staff to handle the increased demand. And Zoe? Well, her employer somehow caught wind of the story. She worked in customer service for a local company, and when her behavior became public knowledge, they decided she wasn't the kind of person they wanted representing their brand. She was let go within 2 weeks. Chloe, Nora, and Ruby didn't escape consequences either. In our interconnected world, stories like this don't stay contained. Their reputations took serious hits in our social circles, and Ruby actually lost a potential job opportunity when the hiring manager found out about the incident. But the best part? About a month later, I got a message from Liam through the restaurant's social media page. He wanted to thank me again for standing up for him and to let me know that he'd been accepted into a graduate program with a full scholarship. The publicity from the incident had somehow reached the admissions committee, and they'd been impressed by his resilience and character. He also mentioned that he'd started dating someone, a fellow student who'd heard his story and been moved by his grace under pressure. Sometimes good things really do happen to good people. As for me? Well, breaking up with Zoe was the best decision I've ever made. I realized I'd been so focused on maintaining peace in our relationship that I'd compromised my own values. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone who would sit silently while others were mistreated just to avoid conflict. But that night changed everything. It reminded me who I really was and what I actually stood for. It taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior, even if it means walking away from them entirely. I started volunteering at a local organization that helps immigrants navigate the job market and workplace discrimination. It felt good to channel my anger into something productive. And you know what? I met some incredible people through that work, people with stories that made Liam's experience seem unfortunately common but also beautifully resilient. Do I regret how everything went down? Not for a second. The only thing I regret is how long it took me to see Zoe's true character. But I guess sometimes we need a shock to wake us up from the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the people we love. The diamond bracelet I'd bought for her? I returned it and used the money to make a donation to the Immigrant Services Organization. It felt like closing a circle somehow, transforming something that represented my old life into something that could help others build new ones. And that expensive dinner? Well, it turns out to be the best money I never spent. Because walking away from that table didn't just save me from picking up a $20,000 tab, it saved me from spending the rest of my life with someone who had no compassion for others. You know what's funny? Zoe tried to get back together with me about 6 months later. She'd lost her job, lost most of her friend group, and apparently had time to reflect on her behavior. She sent me this long message about how she'd changed, how she'd learned from her mistakes, how she wanted to make things right. But here's the thing about character, it's not something you can just change overnight. Real change takes time, consistent effort, and genuine remorse. And I could tell from her message that she was more sorry about the consequences of her actions than about the actions themselves. I wished her well in her journey of self-improvement, but I made it clear that I'd moved on. Because I had, not just from her, but from the version of myself that would accept cruelty as long as it wasn't directed at me. These days, I'm dating someone new. Her name is Iris, and she's exactly the kind of person who would have stood up for Liam without hesitation. In fact, that's how we met, at a volunteer event where she was teaching English to recent immigrants. Watching her interact with people, treating everyone with respect and kindness regardless of their background or circumstances, I knew I'd found someone special. The other night, we went out to dinner at that same restaurant where everything went down. Liam is now the general manager, and when he saw me, his face lit up with recognition. He came over to our table personally to thank me again and to tell me about all the positive changes in his life. As I watched him chat with other diners, switching effortlessly between languages to make everyone feel welcome, I felt this overwhelming sense of rightness about how everything had played out. Sometimes the most dramatic moments in our lives aren't just about what we lose, they're about what we discover we never want to lose again. So yeah, that's my story. The night a $20,000 dinner bill taught me the true cost of staying silent in the face of cruelty. The night I learned that walking away from someone you love is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for them, for others, and most importantly, for yourself. And you know what the craziest part is? I genuinely believe I did Zoe a favor that night. By refusing to enable her behavior, by letting her face the full consequences of her actions, I gave her the opportunity to become a better person. Whether she takes that opportunity or not is up to her, but at least I didn't stand in the way of her potential growth by cushioning the blow of her own choices. That's the thing about real love, sometimes it means saying no. Sometimes it means walking away. And sometimes it means letting someone experience the natural consequences of their behavior, even when it's painful to watch. I sleep better at night knowing that I stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself. I feel proud of the person I've become since that night, someone who won't compromise her values for the sake of keeping the peace. And every time I see Liam at the restaurant, thriving in his new role and building the life he dreamed of, I'm reminded that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice. But it's always worth it in the end. Because at the end of the day, we all have to look at ourselves in the mirror. And I want to see someone looking back who stands up for what's right, even when it costs her everything she thought she wanted. Even when it costs $20,000. The months that followed were like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Each consequence led to another, creating this beautiful chain reaction of justice that I couldn't have orchestrated if I'd tried. About 3 months after the incident, I was having coffee with my friend Ava when she brought up something interesting. "Did you hear about that whole situation with Dean Cross?" she asked, stirring her latte. Dean was Zoe's older brother, and I'd met him a few times at family gatherings. He worked in finance and had always seemed like a decent enough guy, though I'd never spent much time with him. "What about him?" I asked. Apparently he heard about what happened at the restaurant, and he was furious with Zoe. Like, absolutely livid. He called her out publicly at their cousin's wedding last weekend. This was news to me. "Really?" "Yeah, my friend Jake was there, he's dating their cousin." He said Dean stood up during the reception dinner and made this whole speech about treating service workers with respect. He didn't mention Zoe by name, but everyone knew what he was talking about. Jake said you could cut the tension with a knife. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness hearing this. It was good that someone in Zoe's family was holding her accountable, but I also felt bad that it had come to public humiliation at a family event. How did Zoe react? I couldn't help but ask. She left. Just walked right out of the wedding reception. Her parents were mortified. This got me thinking about Zoe's parents, who I'd always liked. Her mom, Vera, had been nothing but kind to me during our relationship. I wondered how they were handling everything. As if reading my mind, Ava continued, Jake also mentioned that her parents had been going to family therapy. Apparently, this whole thing made them realize they'd been enabling Zoe's behavior for years. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd always wondered why Zoe felt so entitled to treat people poorly, and now it was starting to make sense. When someone grows up without consequences, they never learn empathy. But the story gets even more interesting. Remember how I mentioned that someone had recorded part of the incident on their phone? Well, it turns out that person was Cole Vale, a guy I'd gone to high school with but hadn't seen in years. Cole had started a small social media marketing business, and he'd been at the restaurant that night for a client dinner. He'd recognized me from across the room and had been debating whether to come say hello when he witnessed the whole thing with Liam. He told me later that he'd started recording because he was so shocked by what he was seeing. He'd never posted the video publicly, but he had shown it to a few people to get their opinions on whether he should report it to the restaurant management. One of those people was his client that night, a woman named Ruby Hill who owned a chain of local businesses. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Ruby Hill was also on the board of directors for several professional organizations in our city. When she saw the video, she was so disgusted by the behavior that she started asking around about who the girls were. It didn't take long for her to identify them, especially Chloe, who worked for one of the companies that did business with Ruby's organizations. Within weeks, Chloe found herself mysteriously losing client accounts and being passed over for promotions. Nothing that could be directly traced back to the incident, but in a small business community, word travels fast about character issues. Nora faced similar consequences. She'd been applying for a management position at a local nonprofit, and during the interview process, her references were checked more thoroughly than usual. One of the board members happened to know someone who'd witnessed the restaurant incident, and suddenly Nora was no longer being considered for leadership roles. But here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. Remember how I mentioned that Zoe worked in customer service? Well, her termination wasn't quite as straightforward as I initially thought. It turns out that one of her colleagues at work had been at the restaurant that night with his family. His name was Max Gray, and he'd been sitting 2 tables away from us with his wife and teenage daughter. Max later told me that his daughter, who was 16 at the time, had been watching the whole thing unfold with increasing distress. She'd kept asking him why no one was helping the waiter, why those women were being so mean. That night, his daughter went home and wrote a blog post about bystander apathy and how watching people be cruel to service workers had made her feel complicit. She didn't name anyone or give specific details, but she wrote powerfully about the responsibility we all have to speak up when we witness injustice. The post went viral among teenagers in our area, and eventually made its way back to adults, including some of Zoe's co-workers. When they realized she was the person the post was indirectly about, it created a hostile work environment. Customers started complaining when she handled their accounts, saying they'd heard she was rude to service workers. Her manager tried to handle it quietly at first, moving her to back office work where she wouldn't interact with customers. But the damage to the company's reputation was already done. When a local news station picked up the story about the teenager's viral blog post, they reached out to the restaurant to get the other side of the story. The restaurant, to their credit, declined to give specific details about individual incidents. But they did talk about their general policies regarding customer behavior and their commitment to protecting their staff from harassment. That's when more stories started coming out. Other service workers began sharing their own experiences with similar treatment, and a pattern emerged of certain groups of people who regularly made restaurant and retail workers' lives miserable. A local journalist named Miles Day started investigating what he called service worker abuse in our city. His article, which ran in the main newspaper, didn't name anyone specifically but painted a devastating picture of entitlement and cruelty in our supposedly progressive community. The article caught the attention of some city council members, who proposed new ordinances protecting service workers from harassment. The proposed legislation was nicknamed Liam's Law by supporters, though Liam himself had never sought publicity for what happened to him. All of this attention made it impossible for Zoe's employer to keep her on staff. The final straw came when a customer recognized her voice on the phone and specifically requested to speak to someone else, saying they didn't want to do business with that woman who bullies waiters. But you know what? I actually started feeling sorry for Zoe at this point. Don't get me wrong, I still believe she'd brought all of this on herself. But watching someone's entire life collapse, even someone who'd behaved terribly, isn't exactly satisfying. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I reached out to her. We met at a coffee shop across town, somewhere neutral where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. She looked different, thinner, tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. Her usual confidence was completely gone. "Why did you want to see me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Because I wanted to see how you were doing," I said honestly. "I heard about everything that's been happening." She laughed bitterly. "Oh, you mean my complete and total social destruction? Yeah, it's been great." We sat in awkward silence for a moment before she continued. "I know you probably think I deserve all of this. I think you made choices that had consequences," I replied carefully. "But I don't think anyone deserves to have their entire life destroyed." That's when she started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen from her before, but genuine, heartbroken sobs. "I don't understand how everything went so wrong so fast," she whispered. "It was just one dinner. One stupid dinner." And that's when I realized she still didn't get it. She was focused on the consequences rather than understanding why her behavior had been wrong in the first place. "Zoe," I said gently, "it wasn't about one dinner. It was about the kind of person you revealed yourself to be that night. And based on what people are saying, it wasn't the first time." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that treating people badly isn't something you just do once when you're having a bad day. It's a pattern. And that night, I saw a pattern I'd been ignoring for 2 years." We talked for over an hour. She told me about losing her job, about the strain it had put on her friendships and family relationships, about the therapy her parents had insisted she attend. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but I could tell she was still more focused on her own suffering than on the suffering she'd caused others. When I suggested she might want to apologize to Liam directly, she became defensive. "I already tried that," she said. "I went to the restaurant, but they said he was too busy to see me." "Did you try writing a letter?" I asked. "What would be the point? He probably hates me." "The point would be that you acknowledge the harm you caused, regardless of whether he forgives you or not." She stared at her coffee cup for a long time before speaking again. Would you help me write it?" I was surprised by the request, but after thinking about it, I agreed. Not because I wanted to get back together with her or because I thought one apology letter would fix everything, but because I believed everyone deserves a chance at redemption if they're willing to do the hard work. We spent the next week crafting a letter that took full responsibility for her actions without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. It was harder than she expected. Every draft she wrote initially tried to minimize what she'd done or explain why she'd been having a bad day. "You can't apologize and make excuses at the same time," I kept telling her. "Either you're sorry for your behavior, or you think your behavior was justified. You can't have it both ways." The final letter was simple and direct. She acknowledged that she had deliberately humiliated him for her own entertainment, that her behavior was unacceptable regardless of the circumstances, and that she understood if he never wanted to hear from her again. She also included information about a donation she'd made to the Immigrant Services Organization in his name. I helped her deliver the letter to the restaurant, though I made it clear I wasn't doing it as her girlfriend or even as her friend. I was doing it as someone who believed in the possibility of redemption. Liam never responded to the letter, which was his right. But the restaurant manager later told me that he'd appreciated the gesture and that it had helped him feel more closure about the incident. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of that night continued to spread in ways I never could have imagined. Remember Ruby Hill, the business owner who'd seen the video? She ended up using the incident as a case study in her workshops on workplace harassment and bystander intervention. The story became part of training programs for managers throughout our city, teaching them how to recognize and address discriminatory behavior. The teenager who'd written the viral blog post, Max Gray's daughter, started a social media campaign called #ServerSupport, encouraging people to share positive stories about service workers and to speak up when they witnessed harassment. The campaign gained national attention and led to similar movements in other cities. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence came about 6 months later, when I received a call from a woman named Iris West. She worked for a nonprofit that provided legal services to immigrants, and she'd heard about what happened from Liam. "I know this might sound strange," she said over the phone, "but Liam mentioned that you stood up for him that night, and I wondered if you might be interested in joining our board of directors." I was flattered but confused. "I don't have any legal background," I told her. "We're not looking for lawyers," she explained. "We're looking for people who understand what it means to take a stand for what's right, even when it's difficult. Liam spoke very highly of your character." That conversation led to a meeting, which led to me joining the board, which led to some of the most meaningful work I've ever done. Through the organization, I met dozens of people like Liam, hard-working individuals who'd faced discrimination and harassment but refused to let it break their spirits. One of those people was Adam Snow, a former refugee who'd become a successful small business owner. His story particularly resonated with me because he talked about the moment when someone had stood up for him during his early days in America, and how that act of kindness had changed his entire perspective on his new country. "It wasn't a big thing," he told me. "I was having trouble with my English at a government office, and this woman helped translate for me when the clerk was getting impatient. But it showed me that not everyone here would treat me like I was less than human." Hearing stories like Adam's made me realize that my decision to walk away from that dinner table hadn't just been about my relationship with Zoe, it had been about what kind of person I wanted to be in the world. But the story takes another dramatic turn when I discovered something that still gives me chills to think about. Remember how I mentioned that Chloe had been losing clients and getting passed over for promotions? Well, it turns out there was more to that story than I initially knew. About a year after the restaurant incident, I was at a professional networking event when I bumped into someone I hadn't seen since college, a guy named Jude Field who worked in corporate investigations. "Mia," he said, clearly excited to see me. "I've been hoping to run into you. I worked on a case recently that I think you'd find interesting." He went on to explain that he'd been hired by a large corporation to investigate some irregularities in their regional office, the same office where Chloe worked. During his investigation, he discovered that she'd been embezzling money from client accounts for over 2 years. "The weird thing is," he said, "we might never have caught her if her behavior hadn't come under scrutiny for other reasons. The restaurant incident that everyone was talking about made her supervisors take a closer look at her work, and that's when the financial discrepancies came to light. I was stunned. "How much money are we talking about?" "Just over $40,000, he replied. She'd been skimming small amounts from multiple accounts, thinking no one would notice. She's facing criminal charges now. This revelation hit me like a truck. It meant that Zoe hadn't just been cruel to Liam, she'd been friends with someone who was actively stealing from her clients. It made me wonder what other red flags I'd missed during our relationship. But the biggest shock was yet to come. A few weeks after my conversation with Jude, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. It was Vera, Zoe's mother, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen her. "Mia," she said when I opened the door, "I need to talk to you." I invited her in, made her some tea, and waited for her to speak. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "A big one." I was confused. "For what?" "For raising a daughter who treated people the way she treated that waiter. For not teaching her basic human decency. For enabling her behavior for so many years that she thought it was normal." The pain in her voice was heartbreaking. This woman had been nothing but kind to me, and now she was blaming herself for her adult daughter's choices. "Vera," I said gently, "you're not responsible for Zoe's actions." "But I am, in a way," she replied. "Do you know what she told me when all of this started? She said she thought it was funny because that's how rich people act in movies. She genuinely believed that being cruel to service workers was just part of being successful." She went on to explain that she and Zoe's father had been going to family therapy, trying to understand where they'd gone wrong. The therapist had helped them see that they'd accidentally taught Zoe that she was better than other people by shielding her from consequences and always taking her side in conflicts. "We never made her get a service job when she was a teenager," Vera continued. "We paid for everything, so she never had to work her way through school. She never learned what it felt like to depend on tips or to deal with difficult customers." "But that doesn't excuse what she did," I pointed out. "No, it doesn't. But it explains it. And it's why I'm here." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you." Inside was a check for $5,000. "I can't accept this," I said immediately. "It's not charity," she explained. "It's payment for a service. You did something that night that we should have done years ago. You held Zoe accountable for her behavior. You gave her consequences that we never did. And while it's been painful to watch, I think it might ultimately save her." I tried to give the check back, but she insisted. "Use it for your volunteer work," she said. "Use it to help people like that young man she hurt. Let some good come from all of this." After she left, I sat with that check for a long time, thinking about how complex the aftermath of that one dinner had become. It wasn't just about Zoe learning a lesson or getting revenge, it was about entire families and communities grappling with questions of accountability, privilege, and character. I eventually used the money to start a scholarship fund through the Immigrant Services Organization, specifically for people working in the service industry who wanted to pursue higher education. We named it the Liam Initiative, with his permission, and it's funded 2 students so far. But you want to know the most dramatic twist of all? The one that still makes me shake my head in disbelief? About 18 months after the restaurant incident, I was at a coffee shop near my office when I overheard a familiar voice. I looked up to see Nora at a nearby table, talking on her phone in what she clearly thought was a private conversation. "I'm telling you, the whole thing was Mia's fault," she was saying. "She set us up. She planned the whole thing just to make us look bad." My blood started boiling as I listened to her rewrite history. She deliberately didn't tell us she wasn't paying for dinner, and then she had the nerve to act all high and mighty about us having some fun with the waiter. The guy barely spoke English. How were we supposed to know he'd be so sensitive about it? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything that had happened, after all the consequences they'd faced, she was still trying to play the victim. But then I heard something that made my jaw drop. The craziest part is that she's dating that immigrant organization lady now. I bet they planned the whole thing together. It's probably some kind of scam to make money off of bleeding hearts who want to help poor immigrants. She was talking about Iris, the woman I'd started dating a few months earlier. The same Iris who'd asked me to join the nonprofit board, who'd become one of the most important people in my life. But here's what Nora didn't know: Iris and I hadn't even met until months after the restaurant incident. Her entire conspiracy theory was based on a timeline that didn't exist. I was so angry I almost marched over to confront her, but then I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. Nora's delusions weren't hurting me, they were hurting her. By refusing to accept responsibility for her actions, by creating elaborate theories about how she'd been wronged, she was ensuring that she'd never learn from her mistakes. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, unable to grow or change because she couldn't admit she'd done anything wrong in the first place. That's when I truly understood the difference between justice and revenge. Justice had already been served, all four of them had faced natural consequences for their behavior. But revenge would have been me trying to hurt them further, trying to make them suffer beyond what their own actions had already caused. And looking at Nora, sitting alone in a coffee shop, spinning conspiracy theories to avoid facing the truth about herself, I realized that revenge wasn't necessary. The worst punishment they could face was being trapped inside their own lack of self-awareness. Meanwhile, Liam had been promoted again and was now the regional manager for the restaurant chain. He'd gotten married to that fellow student I mentioned, and they'd just bought their first house. He'd also become a spokesperson for worker rights organizations, sharing his story at conferences and helping to train managers on how to handle customer harassment. The last time I saw him, he thanked me again for that night, but then he said something that really stuck with me. You know, in a strange way, I'm grateful it happened. Not for the pain of it, but for everything good that came afterward. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives create opportunities for the best ones. He was right. That terrible dinner had led to me finding meaningful work, meeting the love of my life, and discovering parts of myself I never knew existed. It had also created positive changes in my community and helped protect other service workers from similar treatment. As for Zoe, the last I heard, she'd moved to another city and was working at a call center while going to therapy twice a week. According to her mother, she was slowly starting to understand the impact of her actions, but it was a long process. Her friendships with Chloe, Nora, and Ruby had completely dissolved. Chloe was dealing with her legal troubles, Nora was still trapped in her victim mentality, and Ruby had actually reached out to apologize to me through a mutual friend, though I never responded. Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled things differently that night. Maybe I should have tried harder to get them to stop. Maybe I should have confronted them more directly instead of just walking away. But then I remember something my therapist told me during one of our sessions: you can't save people from themselves. All you can do is refuse to participate in their dysfunction and hope that your example inspires them to change. That's exactly what I did that night. I refused to participate in cruelty, even when it cost me a relationship I thought I wanted. And you know what? It was worth every penny of that $20,000 bill I didn't pay. These days, when I tell this story, people always ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to them. The answer is no. I feel sad that they made choices that led to painful consequences, but I don't feel guilty for refusing to enable those choices. Everyone at that table that night had a choice. They could have chosen kindness, respect, and basic human decency. Instead, they chose cruelty, entitlement, and harassment. The consequences that followed weren't my fault, they were the natural result of their own behavior. But here's the thing that really gets me: if they'd just been decent human beings that night, if they'd treated Liam with basic respect, none of this would have happened. We'd have had a lovely birthday dinner, I'd have given Zoe her present, and we'd probably still be together today. Instead, they revealed their true character in the most public way possible, and everything that followed was simply the world responding to that revelation. The saddest part is that it didn't have to be this way. At any point during that dinner, any one of them could have said, "Hey, let's not do this. Let's just enjoy our meal and treat everyone with respect." But they chose not to. And that choice, that fundamental choice between kindness and cruelty, changed all of our lives forever. Sometimes I think about parallel universes, about what might have happened if things had gone differently that night. In those universes, maybe Zoe and I are still together. Maybe we're married by now, maybe we have kids. But then I think about the person I've become since that night, the work I'm doing, the love I've found with Iris, the positive changes in my community, and I realize I wouldn't trade this reality for any of those alternate versions. Because this version of my life is built on a foundation of integrity. It's built on the knowledge that I stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. It's built on authentic relationships with people who share my values. And most importantly, it's built on the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away. That $20,000 dinner bill wasn't just the cost of their meal, it was the price of their character. And apparently, their character wasn't worth very much at all. But mine? Mine turned out to be priceless.